turns into the chicane. Right, left, right.
With the 2000 F1 Championship being hotly contested by Schumacher, Coulthard and Hakkinen, Ferrari number 2 Rubens Barrichello must have been feeling somewhat overlooked, especially after technical issues forced him to take his spare car for qualifying in Germany. The car was not set up properly and could only manage 18th on the grid in difficult damp conditions. David Coulthard ended up taking pole position, and what a pole it was! 1.4 seconds up with his screaming Mercedes engine. Championship leader Michael Schumacher was second, ahead of Fisichella and Hakkinen, and then a very impressive showing from Pedro de la Rosa in the Arrows. The Williamses of Ralf Schumacher and rookie Jenson Button could only manage 14th and 16th, and there's the aforementioned Barrichello languishing in P18. Oops, and Williams' weekend got worse before the race even started. That's Jenson Button stalling on the grid at the start of the formation lap. Interestingly, this wasn't the most embarrassing thing that had happened to Jenson that weekend, as he'd already damaged his car in practice while entering the pit lane. The team were able to get his car restarted in time for the race, but ironically, the Butt would have to start from the bottom of the order. When the race began, Coulthard immediately moved across to cover off Schumacher, but this allowed Hakkinen to fly through into the lead. Then there was drama as Fisichella ran into the back of Schumacher at turn 1, taking out the championship leader in his home Grand Prix. It was a heavy shunt, but both drivers walked away unharmed, albeit rather disgruntled. In this quite scary replay, you can see Fisichella's helmet hitting the floppy part of the barrier, and I hate to imagine how much worse this would have been if he'd been going just a little bit faster. I'm so glad he was okay. This was actually the second race in a row where both Schumacher and Fisichella had gone out at the first corner, although in Austria neither of them were to blame for this accident. Meanwhile, there was no safety car, so the race went on, with Jos Verstappen moving up into 7th place past Villeneuve, and Barrichello moving up into the top 10 after an awesome start. At the end of the first lap, the order was Hakkinen, Coulthard, Trulli, De La Rosa and Irvine. On lap 2, Barrichello got up into 9th position past Zonta, as ahead of him Herbert passed Irvine for 5th. It was an absolute slipstream fest around the old Hockenheim ring as Verstappen challenged the Arrows too. And now he's done it, up into 6th place. That's both Arrows into the points now. Say, isn't it ironic that the bright orange car is being driven by the father of the Orange Army? Max Verstappen was just 2 years old at this time. Now, here's a good demonstration of why I love slipstreaming circuits like the old Hockenheim, and that's because cars which would normally be backmarkers can sometimes fight for results. Watch as Irvine's Jaguar actually pulls away slightly from Barrichello at the end of the straight, and that's partly because he actually has less downforce than the better developed Ferrari. Normally this would be a big disadvantage in terms of lap time, but it can actually help slower cars to prevent people from overtaking them, which is why the Jaguars and Arrows are doing well on this occasion. It's also partly how Nick de Vries was able to score points on his debut for Williams, and why the slowest cars tend to be really fast through speed traps. With that being said, braking ability and the inside line still work wonders, and that's Barrichello up to 7th.
Verstappen, the Dutchman, who was not in very good odour this morning because in the warm-up he drove into Jacques Villeneuve's BAR.
Interestingly, I couldn't find any pictures or videos of this accident, but it must have been a fairly big one because apparently Verstappen suffered abrasions and was in pain during the race. Apparently Coulthard also had an accident in warm-up, but this one too has been lost to time. Lap 5 now, and Barrichello is already up into the points. That did not take long at all, and it took even less time to pass Herbert. This is the very same lap. The ticker on your bottom of the screen hadn't even done a full scroll past, and it already had to update itself again. And again now, that's Frentzen passing Irvine for 8th. Jolly good.
Barrichello now has really got his dander up.
Whoa, Murray, that's a little explicit, don't you think? We don't need to know what Rubens is doing with his dander right now. I mean, whatever works for him, I guess. He's up into 4th place. The first mechanical failure of the race was Johnny Herbert, who had been doing a great job for Jaguar, but whose car could never seem to do a great job for him. By this point, Johnny had already announced that he would be leaving F1 at the end of the season, although I was surprised to learn that a lot of people expected him to go to Champ Car for 2001. Of course, he still went to America, but to compete in the ALMS instead. Back to the race, Barrichello was still flying, and here's his move on Jarno Trulli as he goes up the inside for 3rd place, and he made it look easy as pie. The only cars left for him to catch were now the 2 McLarens, who were leading by 12 seconds. Skipping ahead a bit now, the race began to settle down and pit stops began to take place. Frentzen and Barrichello had both been in for the first stop by this point, but the McLaren showed no sign of slowing down anytime soon. Surely it would take a miracle for anyone to catch them now, like, I don't know, a random guy walking on the track? Oh my goodness, look! There's a random guy walking on the track! This is a 47-year-old French mechanic who had recently lost his job at a Mercedes-Benz factory, and he'd clearly not taken it well because here he was completely disrupting the race in protest. Good work from the drivers not to hit him, goodness. What a lot of people don't realise is that this was actually the third time that this man had attempted to disrupt a Grand Prix, as he had unsuccessfully tried to enter the track at the French Grand Prix, and then again on the formation lap here at Hockenheim, but he was stopped by marshals both times. Interestingly, this man ended up apologising for his stunt, and he was awarded 91,000 francs in a court case against Mercedes, who had, it turns out, dismissed him unfairly. He was only fined the equivalent of 6,300 francs for his part in the track invasion. As for the race, the safety car was called, and the field bunched right up as several drivers pitted. The driver who probably got the worst of the situation was David Coulthard, who stayed out initially to avoid stacking up behind Hakkinen, but then came in the second time around when the pack had already been bunched up, causing him to drop to 6th place.
Ding dong, are we going to see a race now?
Yes, indeed we are, Murray, because as the race resumed, it was beginning to rain. The order was Hakkinen, Trulli, Schumacher, De La Rosa and Frentzen, with Coulthard right behind them in 6th place, as everyone locked up into turn 1. It was 2 by 2 heading through Clark as Trulli fended off Barrichello and De La Rosa fended off Frentzen. I haven't spoken about 7th place much, but that was now being contested between Ralf Schumacher and Jacques Villeneuve, and it was Villeneuve who came out ahead here. Then, just to make sure Ralf wouldn't come back at his teammate, the other BAR of Zonta ran straight into the back of the Williams, spinning him around and forcing Verstappen to take avoiding action. Suddenly, there was a much bigger accident in the pack as Deniz and Alesi made contact, causing the Prost driver to spear off into the barriers and spin violently. Wheels went flying as tethers failed, but luckily there were no serious injuries. With that being said, Jean Alesi did suffer from some quite painful symptoms after this, including dizziness and abdominal pain, but that's to be expected in a crash of this brutality. At least he can be comforted by the fact that this wasn't his fault. The replay shows that Deniz came right over into his car and left him no space at all, leading to this huge shunt. Watch how Alesi's head reacted to the impact by flying forwards, which luckily can't happen nowadays since the drivers are all required to wear the HANS device. Once again, the safety car was called. When the race resumed again, off went Alex Wurz on the straight! His car had seized up with a gearbox failure, and Mika Salo did a fantastic job not to run straight into the back of him as the Benetton went out of control. Wurz stopped right on the racing line, although impressively the marshals were able to push the car away without the need for another safety car. Now, here's a shot that shows two things. Firstly, it shows the nicely toasted Fonmetal engine of Marc Genet, but secondly, it shows just how dark the clouds are overhead. The rain was picking up, and suddenly there was a bizarre situation where the forest section was bone dry, but the stadium section was under a torrential downpour, as Eddie Irvine there found out. Meanwhile, here's the two BAR drivers committing the cardinal sin of running into each other, and round and round and round again went Villeneuve on the greasy track. That's a 10 for style for sure. Into the pits came Hakkinen, Trulli and De La Rosa for rain tyres, and through went Barrichello, Coulthard and Frentzen, who all stayed out. If you're wondering when Coulthard got past Frentzen, don't worry because so am I. Unfortunately, the Australian feed, which is what you're seeing, cut out for about a lap, and it seems that that's when the order changed. Womp womp. Look at this, it's bone dry at the Ost curve and soaking wet in the stadium. Barrichello stays out for another lap. Of course, even those who pitted weren't safe from strife. Trulli was given a 10-second stop-go penalty for overtaking under safety car conditions, halting his progress. By the way, other than the top three, there was one other driver who stayed out on dry tyres. Ricardo Zonta ran in 4th place in what appeared to be an inspired move from the BAR driver. Until he slid off the road, of course. He's done a Sebastian Vettel. Look how damn slippery it is, that is so sketchy. Too sketchy in fact for David Coulthard, who pulled into the pits for wet tyres. It seemed like a no-brainer, but remember, there were still two drivers out there on dry tyres. Barrichello, who led, and Frentzen, who was second but then got passed by Hakkinen. And that's Frentzen slowing! Heinz-Harald Frentzen had been surviving the wet conditions, but he couldn't survive his gearbox giving up, and he retired with just 5 laps to go. Unbelievably, this now meant that Mika Salo was 4th from 15th on the grid, and Jenson Button was 5th from the very back. Both of those drivers had pitted super early for wet weather tyres, and it was this that had elevated them up the field. That, of course, and the Jordan's misfortunes. Out as well was Nick Heidfeld with an alternator failure. 3 laps to go then, and there's the gap that Hakkinen has to gain. On any other day that would be completely unachievable, but Hakkinen was undoubtedly lapping significantly faster than Barrichello and therefore catching. It's worth noting that the dry tyres back in those days were actually grooved, which is why Barrichello isn't quite flying off the road, but with the track soaked, it must still have been a nightmare for him. I imagine it was races like this that went through Lando Norris's mind in Sochi in 2021 as he went for his own first F1 victory. On this occasion though, there was no heartbreak, and Rubens Barrichello came through to become a Grand Prix winner for the very first time. There could not have been a more fairy tale way to do it, coming all the way from the 9th row of the grid, making some superb overtakes and then holding on while the heavens opened. It had taken 123 starts to manifest, which at the time was a record, but he had done it and deservedly so. 2nd and 3rd were the McLarens of Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard, and 4th was actually Jenson Button from the very back of the grid, who had passed Mika Salo near the end of the race. This was a personal best finish for Button, who would have to wait until 2004 for his first podium. The final point went the way of Pedro de la Rosa, who equalled his own personal best result with 6th, and the rest of the finishers were Ralf Schumacher, Jacques Villeneuve, Jarno Trulli, Eddie Irvine and Gaston Mazzacani. Guys, before I give this race a score, I want to let you know that I have a Dailymotion account for all the videos that get taken down from my YouTube channel by the pesky FOM bots. Due to the high levels of parody, review and education my videos contain, I believe that all of them fall under fair use, but sadly this isn't always enough. On my Dailymotion, you can find the 1996 Monaco and Portuguese Grand Prix, as well as the 2008 Japanese Grand Prix, and more. I also now have a Twitch channel where I stream about once a week and would really like to grow my audience. The links to both of these accounts are in the description of this video. Thank you. I gave the Grand Prix a 9 out of 10 overall, which is very nearly a record. It was unpredictable as heck, with so many different spanners being thrown into the proverbial works, including penalties, incidents, rain, and even a man on the flipping track. It was also a key race in the 2000 championship because it brought the top 4 drivers within 10 points of each other with just 5 races remaining, setting up a barnstorming championship fight. I did consider subtracting a point due to the unfairness this invasion caused, but hey, that's sport, and also I think the fairy tale nature of the race makes up for any shenanigans that may have led to it. Thank you, strange man. You may have done something silly, but you gave us a classic of a race in the process. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Rubens Barrichello, not just because he won, but because of the awesome manner in which he won. With that being said, on most other days this award would have gone to Jenson Button or Mika Salo, so they both deserve a shout out as well. I'll give the Inouye Trophy for Worst Driver to Ricardo Zonta, who caused 3 of this race's 5 crunch counts, including one where he ran into his own teammate. Drive safely guys, and I'll see you next time.